Welcome to our McCarthy Tétrault MT Ventures session. MT Ventures is our newly launched division supporting startups exclusively for high potential, high growth startups, where we select a hand-picked number of companies to work with our teams. We have an exclusive discussion this afternoon with our strategic advisors and some of our counsel at the firm, entrepreneurial leaders, to help us think through how to raise your company's profile during the challenges and opportunities that COVID's presented us. And so we're going to talk about, the issues that we've seen during COVID and how we can best grow Canadian startups and create this new economy that we keep talking about, and how MT Ventures can help you and your company. I'm super delighted to have our advisors here today, a strong group of people that are some of my favorite people at McCarthy Tétrault to work with. Just a bit of background about myself before I introduce our panel. I'm the co-founder of MT Ventures, and it is a wholly owned division of the firm. I work with founders, I work with a lot of VCs, private equity, and advise on different areas of venture capital and startup growth. Also on our panel today, I'm really delighted to have Leah Brighton. Leah Brighton is one of our strategic advisors at MT Ventures. She is currently the principal of Mirae Talent and executive search, and she collaborates with technology companies as they scale their teams, and also serves as a talent advisor to MT Ventures. She comes with a diverse background with a master's in speech language pathology, and is also an advisor to the Minister's Advisory Council on Special Education in Ontario. She has a passion for building exceptional teams, and previous to her current role, she was at Wealthsimple. Also on our panel this afternoon is Lina Ismail. She's the managing partner of Think I3. Lina has been instrumental in transforming business models and defining the strategic direction for growth throughout her career as a senior executive in Fintech. She has led the creation of new lines of business, set the direction for innovation, and led the launch of new products and services in markets across Canada, the US, and Europe. She's a champion of innovation and business transformation. She's advocated and actively partnered with startups, accelerators, incubators, and VCs to deliver on transformational strategies. She's been passionate about strengthening the technology ecosystem globally and across multiple verticals such as fintech, prop tech, and retail, and has contributed her time in an advisory capacity. We are super delighted to have Lina Ismail as one of the advisors at MT Ventures. Our third panelist today is Saif Hashmi. He's an associate principal with the IT Venture Fund based out of Toronto at BDC. He joined BDC in 2016 with the Co-Investments Fund, where he worked on some of the top later stage technology deals. In his current role, he's responsible for sourcing and managing deal flow, executing transactions, and assisting in portfolio management post-close. He's been a board observer on a number of different companies, including Axonify, Solink, Kira Talent, among others. Prior to joining BDC, Saif held positions at Broadgrain Commodities as a trading analyst, MTL Capital as a private equity associate, and Industrial Alliance as an equity research associate. We're thrilled to have Saif with us today. And last but not least, one of my favorite people at McCarthy Tétrault, Amy Fong. Amy Fong is counsel and a registered patent and trademark agent with the National Intellectual Property and Technology Group at McCarthy Tétrault, with a degree in engineering physics, comp sci. Amy has helped to obtain patent and trademark protection for clients in a wide range of industries, including software, electronics, medical, imaging, consumer products, food and beverage, hospitality, mining, among others. Her engineering physics degree and her prior engineering and software development work experience enable her to work closely with engineers to identify aspects of their innovation which are suitable for IP protection and monetization. We are thrilled to have Amy with us today. So, to kick this off, this session off today, we want to think through, some of the issues that startups have been facing over the past 6 months. So just to, kick this off, let's describe some of the most difficult challenges that startups have faced over the past 6 months. And I'm going to start with, at the top of my screen, Saif, you're at the top of my screen.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks for the kind introduction. I think, I'll tell you what I experienced, what we experienced at BDC overall with all our portfolio companies. Across different stages of the companies, there was either overreaction or underreaction or no reaction sort of, right? So I felt looking back, because of course there was overreaction most of the time, and because it was a unprecedented crisis, no one knew what to do, so it was expected. But when I look back, a lot of early stage companies who overreacted, basically they were meant to be disruptive, right? So the overreaction was sort of, not like, I wouldn't say it wasn't necessary, but I feel like they were meant to be meant for disruption. So sort of the course should have been more like underreaction or just no reaction at the same time. I feel like overall we saw that a lot of our early stage companies were not as much affected as the late stage companies. Early stage companies were quick to pivot, quick to change strategy and all that. And then in terms of the specific problems, I'd like to share a few. I think there was a cash collection problem with one of our portfolio companies, which I thought was very interesting. They were dealing with a lot of universities as their customers, and universities have never worked from home, so they were having problems doing payments and everything. So there was that sort of a problem where cash collection was an issue. There was another problem where companies were having trouble retaining customers, and what a lot of companies did was provide credits. A good example was our portfolio company based out of Saskatoon, Vendasta. So they started providing credits on a monthly basis, and I personally was tracking in terms of seeing how the company is going back. So they started to, let's say, 90,000 credits per month, and then slowly and gradually it came down to like 10,000 in August or something like that. So that was sort of an indicator for me personally as well how the economy is going. And then the last problem I thought was selling to customers online. This is something very new for a lot of companies. They have never done that. And I think still the major challenge for a lot of companies is selling through online videos. Yeah.
Thanks. I've heard a lot about this overreaction and underreaction. Leah, you're dealing with companies on a daily basis that are growing and contracting. Can you talk about some of the overreaction and underreaction that you're seeing and some of the difficulties that you've seen startups face over the last month?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's, as far as the HR function as a whole, because it has been such an unprecedented time, I think it's fair to say none of us have lived through a global pandemic before. So a lot of companies just put everything on hold. And I think it's a very human response because there was so much uncertainty. And I think if we can, roll back the calendar to March, there was also a lot of fear, just a lot of fundamental fear for groceries, for toilet paper. And so like our basic necessities, as far as Maslow's law, I think taking care of ourselves was like our primary importance. And then the companies and a lot of the individuals within HR were tasked with not simply, the typical, say, payroll, runway, and looking at the standard HR functions, but also trying to get guidance from the federal government, which was in and of itself also figuring out what were the regulations for social distancing, what were the guidelines as far as public transportation. So there were a lot of uncertainties and things in flux that HR was looking at and waiting for other organizations to get their cue. So as far as, kind of an extension and an overreaction, a lot of companies just put everything on hold, which was challenging for candidates who were in process. And in a large part because it was simply communication. The communication, it was hard for them to understand what their communication was for the candidates, and then for the candidates who were waiting in queue. But internally as well, in providing that sense of stability, and I think confidence as far as in this time of uncertainty, the understanding that, your company is still here, that we still are, stable, we're still staying the course, but recognizing that there are still some additional kind of variables at play. So I think for a lot of companies, particularly don't have as large of HR teams or functions available to them, it was really challenging to be able to understand kind of the pathway forward. And I think even today, I mean, even now we're looking to the fall, and there continues to be uncertainty as far as what our numbers look like. In Ontario, we've had certainly an evolution, and in other provinces too across Canada. So yeah, it continues to be like a changing landscape for HR and how they're able to manage it.
Amy, building on what Leah is talking about here, where people have put a lot of things on hold, and saying that, early stage companies were better and more resilient because they could pivot. What are you seeing in the trademark and IP and patent space, where are companies, registering new patents or filing new trademarks, and do you see challenges that have occurred for companies over the past 6 years or 6 months? Amy, you're on mute.
Yes, I can certainly touch on that. So I work with companies at sort of all various stages of growth, from very, very early in the process when they're still developing their technologies, to all the way for established companies who have portfolios already for IP in terms of trademarks and patents. So in terms of the challenges, I think most of the challenges have been later stage companies. So sort of echoing what Saif had said, I mean, I'm so keeping really busy in the last 6 months. The filings, I haven't noticed any significant drop. People are still filing, but a lot of those filings are coming from the early stage high growth companies, the ones who are able to, adapt to the circumstances. And the more established ones where, there are the challenges, the ones who have been doing it for 2 or 3 years and are tied to a particular industry that COVID tends to select for disruption in not a good way. So for example, the hospitality industry, the travel industry, and the live entertainment industry. So if your technology is sort of dependent on revenue streams from those, where I have clients who are largely affected, seeing the revenue pretty much drive overnight. So those have been a bit challenging to deal with because they still have trademark and patents that are in the works, and we've had to make some decisions as to what we need to prioritize because funds are limited. And in many cases, we've had to actually drop something because we just couldn't justify spending the money to continue maintaining certain trademarks. So that's been a challenge, I think, for companies who are more advanced in their growth. And unfortunately, we're in an industry where COVID has impacted their revenue stream. But that said, there's still quite a bit of activity in terms of filings. All the newer companies coming along are still very active in the IP space because IP protection needs to be done at a very early stage. You can't, sit and wait on it for 2 years and decide, oh, I want IP protection. You need to do it from day one. People have been actively filing trademark applications, patent applications. It's just been really busy for the early stages.
It seems like what I'm hearing from all of you is that, early stage companies were much better at responding to the pandemic than some of the later stage companies. Now, Lina, you work with, the earliest stage companies, ones before they've even launched, and later stage companies where, some of them are even IPO ready. What were you seeing as the challenges, your wide range of companies faced over the past 6 months?
Yeah. I would say there are a lot of similarities, between the early stage and later stage companies. And I'll tell you why. I think there is a shift in consumer demands and lifestyles. And I think there's also a shift in the way that we do business. And so whether you're B2B or B2B to C or B2C, I think inevitably companies were dealing with changes to the landscape and the behavior and the buying tendencies of their market. And so I think that has resulted in new products and services, potentially some pivots to existing platforms, and they needed to operate very quickly and iteratively. And I think that we've seen some of those companies be successful and others not so much. I also believe that, there were challenges in being able to really respond proactively. I think that was the bigger issue, is that a lot of companies that I was working with were down a particular path. And so to pivot, yes, the earlier stage companies were probably better at it, but still it was tough for many to ascertain what is the actual, buying behaviors of our consumers, and what are we actually driving towards right now, because everything has kind of blown up and changed dramatically overnight. And so I think the time that they needed to go and assess the market really wasn't afforded to them as it would have been if we weren't going through something like this. And so I think that there was the need to juggle operating the business and moving forward, but then iterating on that product and that service as you continue to move forward with your marketing and sales. And then I think, as Saif had mentioned, with the sales and marketing aspect, suddenly you had to engage differently as well with your audiences and with your customer segments. And I think that there was a challenge in how people were able to adapt to that very quickly, because they weren't. It was tough. And it was tough for people to get used to being able to deal with customers virtually versus in person. And so I think there was a mental shift that had to take place. And I think even what Leah said, there was anxiety and concern that probably affected the performance of the leadership team as well as the employees within these companies. And then I think the idea of how to measure the impact of the pivots that you're making with your customers, that was tough to do. And I think that was a challenge that was pretty apparent for companies that I was working with. But it was important for them to not seek perfection, but to look at, the responses that they were able to measure and then continue to engage with the market. And I think the reality is you need to be fast and you need to be very nimble right now, faster than companies have ever been. And so they just couldn't afford to pull back and slow that down and really do it at a level that they may have wanted to pre-March. So I think fundamentally there was a massive cultural shift and also customer demands that were varying, and the landscape was constantly changing. So the ability of the companies to adapt, as quickly as they needed to was quite challenging.
It's an interesting concept, this, massive cultural shift that you talk about, and, juggling operations versus growth, and how do we look at both of those things? One of the things that, we want to do at MT Ventures, and you guys have all been a part of, is really looking for those opportunities and realizing those opportunities where we can connect, where we can help companies grow, where we can see, something on the horizon that one of our clients might not. And that's why we really think about ourselves as partners. And so, Leah, when you look at companies right now, thinking through, their people operations and their people specialties and juggling their operations versus growth, what do you see as our opportunities for companies right now?
Yeah, so I think one of the key things is really, because we are in this very remote culture. I mean, a lot of the companies within tech have the luxury of being fully remote, which is not a luxury in many other industries, say in service industry and elsewhere. But it also lends itself to still wanting to connect and wanting to create those opportunities and ties as far as team culture and building, whether that's onboarding, whether that's promoting, and whether that's just supporting. I was talking to a director that I was working with, and they were just saying that they described, 6-7 months into this pandemic as this silently exhausting experience. And I think that's like a very accurate sentiment for a lot of people, across organizations. We feel like we're safer now. There isn't that level of heightened fear that we had earlier this year. There's some cadence and normalcy to how, all hands are now online, how one-on-ones and how teams collaborate, but there's still like this exhaustion. And so in the companies across all of them, it's interesting to see how they've worked really hard to still maintain that culture and that connection, and also really embrace, individuals and encouraging them across the teams to take time off, to actually close their laptops and provide that kind of support. And that's been a fundamental difference for the individuals and employees who wanted to stay with their companies and see how they've been able to support them versus look for greener pastures elsewhere to see if maybe there's a company that's better suited for this remote culture, maybe that started it at the outset. So it's been, I think, a really interesting opportunity for companies to be able to pivot and iterate and create new ways to connect and support their team during a very unusual time.
Saif, building on what Leah said, about supporting employees and allowing employees to take time off, BDC is one of those fundamental pillars in the Canadian economy, where when you guys are lending, you're also thinking about how the impact is on the business and on the economy. And one of the things that I think about a lot is you're a different kind of VC. In our conversations about how you think about growth in companies, you're a different kind of VC. So how do you think, or what do you think about the opportunities that companies have going forward?
So the way we are looking at right now, even for new deals, and I think Ali, we spoke about this, is like a matrix view, which is sort of like COVID-specific companies. Let's say there are 5 matrices, 5 categories. So COVID-specific companies such as contact tracing app or stuff like that, which are specifically for these. So opportunities for them, I would say, or something they need to think about is what's going to happen post-COVID, because we all believe this is not going to last forever. So it's going to be like a couple of years, maybe max, right? So hopefully, so we got to think about what's going to happen after that. So that's the opportunity for them, is like thinking about ahead of the future, right? Then there are companies that were positively impacted by COVID, just such as Zoom or Hopin, the platform we're using, all the tech companies. Now for them, it's about taking the advantage of this opportunity. And how are you going to take it? That's the key. You're going to be a little creative. There's a lot of competition. And how are you going to beat the competition? The traditional way, maybe, you got to be 10x better than the competition, or you're going to grow faster than your competitor, right? So thinking from that perspective, that's the opportunity. Now, the third category we think about is the companies that had no impact. For them, I'd say just stay the course. That's the opportunity to just stay focused. Do not get distracted by any of this stuff going around. Just stay focused and maybe not spend too much money, and just focus on staying, as is. And then maybe once you're over this crisis, spend a lot more money on, growing or stuff like that. And then there were companies which were partially, negatively impacted, not much, but like a little bit. And for them, it's the same advice or same opportunity we talk about is focus on retaining your employees, a key talent. Focus on not burning enough cash. Focusing on, having a runway for the next 12 to 18 months. That's the opportunity. Just going to stay on that and think about growing later on. And then the most interesting and most impacted one is the companies that were massively impacted, right? Such as hospitality, travel. We have a couple of companies in our portfolio. We have Hopper, which was significantly impacted, a travel app. We have Sonder, which was significantly impacted. But I like an example, which I want to mention here, is the app called Let's Do It This. It's a US-based app. So what they were doing pre-COVID was sort of aggregating all the marathons around the globe. And then if you want to join a marathon, you can look it up and then join that. And of course, COVID comes in and no one is doing marathons. So what they did was they became creative. They had a GPS watch, which you could use and do marathon from home. Super creative. I thought that was very interesting, right? They pivoted, completely changed. So that's the opportunity. So overall, I think you got to figure out which category where you sort of lie in and think about the opportunity in that space. A little creative overall, I think. But overall, I've seen a lot of, we talked about this before, the advantage here is for a lot of young to mid-tier companies, early to mid-stage companies. Late-stage companies are still finding a lot of this challenge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Lina, you see all sorts of opportunities every day in the fintech space specifically. What opportunities do you see for startups that are moving forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. So focusing on fintech in particular, there's this concept of embedded platforms. And embedded platforms, as we all know it to mean, is, we're going to use, let's say, Klarna, which is providing, the ability to kind of pay as you go for retail items. Well, they're also able to embed loans for small businesses, and they're able to provide other products and services. So we could also take the idea of, our investment. So if we were looking at a Wealthsimple could extend their platform to also offer insurance products. And so we're seeing this convergence and this concept of embedded platforms where we want all these kind of adjacent and complementary services all within one singular, solution. And because it's logical for us as consumers, we're, through a journey, we're going to go through a process and we're going to need to access these things. And if companies do it right, and I think the ones that are in the lead right now that actually have a really tremendous opportunity, because they've already provided digital capabilities and services that have set them apart from the rest that are trying to catch up. I think that's the real opportunity right now for them, especially in the fintech space, because we're seeing that convergence across all these services, and you're seeing these companies able to provide so many additional services through their platform. And I think that will really bode very well for them as well as for their consumer base. And of course, the underlying view there, again, as I've been, a practitioner in this space around innovation, is that you're always focused on the customer journey. Never lose sight of your customer journey. And so that whole idea of keeping a pulse, what's working, what's not. I mean, we can build beacons into the digital platforms, and companies can track and monitor this. But definitely, I think that's the most important thing, because if you're not doing that and you're not doing it actively, then I don't think you're able to seize all the opportunities that are going to be present. I also think that there are tremendous opportunities for strategic partnerships for more early stage companies in the fintech space. I think there are a lot of incumbents that are not going to be able to respond as quickly as they would like. And I think because of COVID-19, they've now just, lit a fire under them to say, you've got to get going, or our customers are going to trail off and they're going to go to other providers. And so I think that there's an opportunity for the early to mid stage startups to create some strategic partnerships where they can be part of incubators that have been established as part of these corporate incumbents, but also there are other sources of capital investment. And so I think a lot of the corporate incumbents are going to want to accelerate their innovation and their digital strategy, and they're going to either look to buy companies or just strategically invest in them and then partner with them to go to market. And so I think there is an opportunity as well to accelerate the go-to-market strategy for a lot of these companies, whereas before or previously it might have taken them, let's say 12 months. Right now it's more like 2 to 4 months. Get out there, get your product in market, because customers need it. And just as Saif was saying, we don't know how long COVID-19 is going to last. We don't know if our entire life and work, style is going to change, indefinitely. And so I think it's really important for companies to seize the moment and get to market as quickly as possible, because I think there's huge opportunities to gain market share right now.
Lina, it's interesting you talk about, the customer journey and focusing on the customer. That's a really good piece of advice for young startups is, focus on the person who's buying your product. Now, one of the things we were on a roundtable yesterday, Leah, Lina, and I, and one of the things that came out of there was, while you're focusing on your customer, remember that the strategic partnership piece is just as important. And so, instead of looking for those small sums of money, look for those big partnerships where you have the real potential to grow and create large sums of capital for your organization, rather than just focusing on little bits of revenue, because hyper growth or high growth companies are not focused on the little bits of revenue, but actually the big growth factor.
Yeah.
Now,
I would say, just on that note, just as you said, that it's the adoption, right? So you're trying to capture that market adoption, and that can really accelerate that.
That's right. That's right. Amy, you're seeing this from a different perspective, right? You're seeing this from the perspective of companies that are coming to you, trying to protect their IP after they thought through their initial product and what their MVP is like. So what opportunities are there for startups as they think through their IP and their protection?
Yeah, for companies that have already filed their patent applications, sometimes and also trademark applications, sometimes the initial product or technology that we were hoping to protect isn't quite what they're doing right now, because companies have had to pivot due to COVID-19. So we're seeing, in terms of opportunities, well, companies have to pivot. So they go and change their technology, and the service a new need that didn't exist before. The old need is no longer relevant. For example, I'm working with a client who is in the live entertainment space. So they create technologies to deal with crowd engagement in person, at least in-person events, which aren't happening anymore. So what they did was they pivoted their technology to service in-person engagement at home. So if you have an employer who wants to deploy some virtual programming to their employees, and they need to engage them a little more, they can transition that technology and to try and increase employee engagement. So that's what they've been doing and been very successful with that. So, but unfortunately, the patent applications that we filed initially we'd have to see if that applies. So, in terms of how we draft patent applications, we're always looking ahead. We're always looking 2 steps ahead and trying to think, okay, a couple of years down the road, what's this technology going to look like? Is it going to be this way? And so in many cases, we've actually sort of predicted what was going to happen. A lot of this stuff is going to go virtual, and we sort of build in language the patent application, which was maybe a couple years ago, to try and cover those future possibilities that will eventually emerge. So yeah, but and this doesn't always happen in that case. Sometimes we end up having to refile new applications because for example, a trademark application that covered soaps and they now are into disinfectants, we need to refile a fresh application to cover the new products that they are launching because of COVID-19. So it's a matter of just figuring out what your strategy was back then. Did it cover what you're doing right now? And then adapting to the circumstances, which may require new filings.
Thank you. Amy and Saif, you both talked about transitioning technology, and I'm going to throw a curveball at you. This is not a question that's in the slide, so forgive me if I'm making you answer on the spot. But you talked about transitioning technology where something doesn't apply or something applied pre-COVID, doesn't necessarily apply post-COVID or during COVID, and so you transition that technology. But some of these industries are not dead, right? Since you talked about hospitality, which is on hold. Amy, you talked about live events, which again are on hold. Hopefully, one day we will be past this pandemic, and hospitality will be a reinvigorated area, or live events will be something that we look at again. So there's got to be some opportunities there where companies right now might be in the development stage or laying low, even though their technology might not be relevant today, right this minute, but will be 6, 12, 18 months from now. So how do you think about companies in those spaces? I'm gonna go with both of you are looking at me like we don't want to answer first. I'll go with Saif first.
Yeah, so the companies who are thinking ahead, I think you're correct. We will be back to normal sooner or later. Hopefully in a year time, that's what we're hoping. As soon as the vaccine is going to come back, companies who are working towards thinking about 1 year from now, I think we are advising them to be just staying the course. The way they were operating before, just stay the course, do that like that. But at the same time, I think the key is trying to be a little more creative, because some things will take time to get back to normal. For example, online selling online, as I mentioned before, I think that's a major challenge a lot of companies see. I think this is going to stay for a while. I think traveling will take it some time. Even though we have a vaccine or whatever, it is a time, you're looking at a couple of years. And when you're talking about startups, early stage startups or even mid stage, they don't have cash flow for 3 years, right? They got to fundraise again, and they need metrics for that and all that. So you got to start thinking about that stuff. So I think yes, we will be back to normal, and you got to be prepared for that. And that's why I mentioned that companies who are focusing just on the COVID related stuff, they should think about when we're back to normal, what are we going to do? But companies that have been impacted by COVID and have pivoted, I think they're in a good position to go back to normal. I'll give you a quick example. We have a company in our portfolio called Sonder, based out of Montreal. They're very similar to Airbnb. The only difference is that they have their own spaces. They manage the spaces themselves rather than Airbnb allowing anyone can become a host, right? So their occupancy went down significantly right before COVID, at the time of the COVID. But they became creative about it. What they did, they started targeting people who were doing 14 days quarantine, and started using selling their facilities to government for government-led quarantine facilities. And what happened was their occupancy went up significantly. They're pretty much back to normal or even more post-COVID. So you just got to be creative a little bit for timing. This is sort of 1 year or 2, and then have the basic model or the basic offering pretty same.
Amy, is there creativity and timing for patent applications or trademark applications, or or should companies be doing that right away? What are your thoughts about the opportunities there for, you know, companies that have been in impacted areas?
Yeah, for companies that have been impacted, and I'm working with a few, it can be a bit of a challenge because you do want to keep your portfolio alive, your patent and trademark portfolio. It's important to your business, and you know you may not have the funds right now to spend on that kind of thing, but you know, 6 to 12 months from now, hopefully things will go back to some normalcy. So for those types of clients, we are sort of taking a deferral strategy when it comes to, you know, actions that have to take place in respect to maintaining their patents and trademarks. I mean, certain things have to be done for sure, like you have to pay regular renewal fees and maintenance fees to maintain issued trademarks and patents, but for certain things in the works, for example, pending patent applications, you can push back a lot of the activity as much as possible. You can defer examination. Examination is when a patent office examiner looks at your patent application and decides whether to reject it or not. And that's when it gets really expensive because you typically spend thousands of dollars arguing with the examiner because they're most likely going to reject your application. You have to justify looking at the patent. So for those types of costs, we try to manage it for the client by pushing that out as far as we can into the future. And we can do that by deferring examination, not responding to things right away, like taking as much time as we can before we file a response. And those sorts of actions is try and steer it so that all the costs are pushed into the future, because you do have a little bit of control over that process. I mean, you don't have control over the initial filings. Those need to be done right away. If you want patent protection, you've got to get that patent filed before you make any public disclosures. You can't push that timing back. You got to file and then disclose, or else you lose your rights to patent it. So those need to be done right away, but everything else can sort of been deferred. So the startups will come to us and say, hey, can we get this patent issued right away? Like, I want it in a year. And we're like, well, it's going to cost you a lot of money. And you sure you want to do that? Because timing wise, you're not going to have the funds to do it until maybe 2 or 3 years down the road. So I would suggest you to try and get it filed, and then sit on it and wait and defer a lot of those costs as much as you can until you're making some money. And until the patent actually is really important to you, because at that 2 or 3 year point, you know, it is important. You do want to enforce it, but until that point, you really don't need it. So that's sort of the strategies that we employ to try and help clients out who are impacted and don't have the funds right away.
That's great. You know, you can defer some of those costs for as long as possible without, you know, breaking things down or halting everything in the midst of the pandemic. I see quite an active chat in the session chat. So if there are any of you who have questions for our speakers, please feel free to put them in our chat, and I'll ask those next. This is one of those questions. My next question is one of those things where, you know, we're all really thinking about, you know, launching new companies. Everyone's thinking about how they can play a role in the pandemic, and what's coming after the pandemic, and how we can impact the world and make the world a better place during and after the pandemic. So what advice is it that you would give to startups, when new startups launch in the middle of this crisis? You know, we're about to see a second wave, potentially a third at some point. We don't know how long this could go on for. What advice do you give someone? Lina, you work with a ton of different startups that are just starting out. What can you tell them?
So I'd probably put them in 3 categories right now, focus, when I think about commercialization and things to think about as you're wanting to launch your startup during this period. And I would say number 1, my thing that, you know, I never stop talking about, as you know, but always spend time learning about your target market, and in the process, don't stop prototyping and validating. So going over behavioral, psychological aspects of your consumer base, wants and needs, how are they evolving, identifying new segments that weren't previously considered, because it could open up opportunities that you didn't anticipate. So just pay attention to those things, because it may present new areas and new opportunities within the market. And then look at new markets. I think one of the greatest opportunities right now is that because we're really working in a virtual world, and it is much more acceptable to do business through virtual channels, that there are far more opportunities right now to go to new markets, and potentially new markets that have maybe lower barriers to entry around regulatory and legal frameworks. So I think that that's really important to think about and evaluate that and evaluate the globe, because really it's open, right? And it's open for business. And then I think it's really about number two is moving quickly. I can't emphasize that enough. I think right now it's about getting to market as fast as you can. But in doing so, when you got to be cost conscious as an early stage startup and launching in this period, you got to stay true to a minimum viable product. I think that's so important. And often, companies struggle with how much is enough. And again, map that back to your customer profile, whether you're selling to businesses or consumers. Understand those immediate needs and what you really need for a minimum viable product, because sometimes you don't need much. Think about the best of the best out there, the Ubers of the world. They launched with a very basic bare bones, capability, but it, caused massive disruption and change and met the needs of consumers that wanted to travel. I think also Airbnb is an interesting one lately when you think about the fact that, no one's traveling, but what have they done? They've started to become more of an aggregator of activities and, pre kind of packaged getaways that are local and much more activity-based services, also community-based. So bringing communities together and creating a much more kind of unified view locally versus always looking about, getting on a plane and traveling. So I think that's a great example. And then again, test, learn, and improve constantly. So that's the whole thing about moving quickly, because you really want that feedback loop from your customer base to be constant and to be proactive so you can stay ahead of the curve. And then channel strategy. That's the third one, super important. Again, talking about embedded platforms. If you're looking at a company that's in market, has a great position right now, and could really use your service as a bolt-on, think about that. I think that's an awesome way to get out there, to get access to a captive audience of consumers. And I think that's a way to increase your adoption immediately. And then the multi-channel approach, keep that working simultaneously. So never kind of focus just on one, but look at strategic partnerships where you can leverage to increase your access to new customers, but also maintain the view that multi-channel, if you believe that that's the direction for your business, keep that going in parallel, because I think that there's really there's a risk if you don't, I would say, and there would see no harm in doing so, and it doesn't take a ton of effort to do that. And then I would say just lastly, in times of disruption, you really want to make sure that you're connecting with your core mission of your business, that you're able to nimbly reset your vision and values to adapt to the current times. You're shifting and making a very conscious decision as you're looking to launch from management to leadership, empowering your employees, however many you have. You all need to play different roles, and you got to be very much hands-on, and prioritizing those strategic relationships and customer opportunities, even if you feel that it goes against what you originally thought you were going to set out to do. Seize those moments, because that will help you accelerate and get to market quickly. And then lastly, I would say learn, unlearn, and experiment constantly.
Saif, you have a huge range of companies. Some are in the start at the very early stage, and Lina talked about MVPs and learning and unlearning and adapting to the environment. What is the advice that you would give these new startups about their MVPs and learning and unlearning?
I think Lina covered majority of the things I was going to talk about, and those were some really good points actually. But I think shifting a little bit from there, I would say I think the first and foremost thing, and that's what we have been telling all our portfolio companies, and it trickles down from our management, I'd say, is that take good care of yourself personally. It's a very challenging time, and make sure all your employees are doing well, health-wise, everything. Take a break. I think Leah mentioned this as well, like working from home. We don't have an office space. It's hard to differentiate between work and home. So it's very important. Like even if you're starting a company, or working on a project, working on a company, take a good care of your health. The other thing I'm trying to sending material on and trying to tell companies is about, as I mentioned before, is learning how to sell online. I think there's a lot of material online for that. I don't need to go into specifics for that. Zapier has a really good material for working virtually or working from home. I think all startups should download that manual and at least read it. so learn how to sell online. I think that's the other thing I'm sort of telling. And then the last thing, which is I'm constantly keep telling all my companies that, and they all know, but it's sort of like a reminder, is that startup is like a marathon. It's not a 100-meter race. It's not, it takes a lot of resilience, patience, and everything. Just have that mindset. It's always important to remind yourself of that. We easily forget that. So keep that in mind, especially with the challenging time we have, we forget all that, right? So keep that in mind, that this is a marathon. You got to be resilient. You got to be patient. And we're all in this together. We're going to be out of it. And eventually, the company, the project, your mission, as Lina mentioned, focus on that, and you're going to be successful.
Leah, Saif talks about a lot of what you deal with on a regular basis, about employees and employee health and wellness, and taking time off to support your employees. What is the advice that you would give your startups that are launching in the middle of all of this?
Yeah, so I think both, like Lina and Saif both mentioned, the customer life cycle, and from an HR perspective, we really think about the employee life cycle. And that really starts right from the recruitment process, right? So the initial reach out and the conversation, as far as, the beginning, it's not, a lot of people think the employee life cycle starts on day one, but it's really that first initial contact. And honestly, even just the employee brand or the employer brand, and what, individuals think of. So prospective candidates think of when they hear your company or they see your logo. That's all part of it. And I think, when looking at that employee life cycle, it's divided into, say, the recruitment phase, and then the onboarding phase, and then the matriculation if they choose to go seek other opportunities. But through all those phases is really communicating. There's additional questions that candidates always have, whether they now ask them during the interview process. They're definitely present for every candidate that I've spoken to as they've been interviewing. And it's beyond, mission and team culture and team fit. But now there are additional questions around, what does working within the context of COVID in your company look like? What will it potentially look like, once there's a vaccine? Will we all be expected to come back to work automatically? What potentially, is that path forward? And it's all right, for companies to say to candidates, this is where we're at right now, and this is what we, expect for the future. That may change, but just having that as part of the conversation is really great for candidates to feel as though, for these high-risk companies, because a lot of these companies that are just starting out are much higher risk, and which can be an additional question that candidates look at in an environment where they're looking for more stability, but how companies, as they're looking to hire, younger startups and companies, they can mitigate those concerns by just having those conversations right at the onset. And then that's true for the companies or the employees who are currently within that company, and talking about some very hard conversations that a lot of companies are having, whether it's salary freezes, whether it's promotional freezes, and even runway within the company itself. So what I would really encourage, all the companies, whether you're, starting from day one today, or, you've been around for a little while, is just to communicate. And it goes such a long way as far as from HR and from talent, and from being able to really retain your employees, attract great talent, and be able to grow in the way that you want to.
Amy, thoughts about advice that you would give to startups right now, especially in the technology space?
Yeah.
IP?
So from an IP perspective, IP tends to be a long-term type of thing, because when you try to get protection, you file your applications, you typically don't get results until 3 to 5 years down the road. So it's quite a long-term thing. So even though COVID makes everything uncertain, you don't even know what's going to happen in 6 months from now or a year from now, I always tell clients, you got to have a plan when it comes to intellectual property. This plan is not going to be a 6 to 12 month plan. This plan is going to be your 3 to 5 year plan. And you've got to figure out what that plan is going to be. So you need to do an audit of all your intellectual property assets. So by that I mean look at what you bring to the table in terms of your IP. Is it, for once, every company has a trademark, so you've got your brand, so you got to protect that. But you might also have other assets too, such as technology that you've created, and know-how, and you want to figure out how you protect those. Also, another thing that companies are developing are industrial design. So if, for example, you're creating a product with innovative appearance, such as a shoe, that's an industrial design. You might want to as well. I want to touch on some of the points that I've seen coming in the chat panel. There's an interesting back and forth discussion about the value of patents. I say patents are not for everybody. In fact, I've advised.
Yeah,
there's quite a few debate. There's a bit of a debate. I actually tell clients a lot of times, don't bother with a patent. It's not really for you. It doesn't work for everybody, and I acknowledge that as a patent lawyer. And but for some companies, it is really key to their growth, because what a patent enables you to do is it enables you to prevent others from making, using, or selling an invention, and that can be a very powerful tool. And we're seeing that play out a lot in the fintech space right now, because there's a lot of disruptive technologies. Well, we think of it as disruptive, but an ordinary consumer, you got a patent. How did you manage to get a patent on that? But in the technology space, it's disruptive, and whoever got a patent on it is able to leverage that and prevent others from using it, or be able to obtain licensing fees for all the banks, all the fintech companies are using this disruptive technology. So for certain companies, it does make sense from a growth perspective, because then you can control your asset, you can control who can use your technology, and then if someone wants to use it, they have to pay you a licensing fee. So for those types of technologies, we say, yeah, go ahead, get your application filed, and then you can make the decisions 2 or 3 years down the road as to where you want to go with that, because you don't have to really do much. Once an application is filed, you just file it and you kind of sit and wait. There's not much going on because the examiners take a lot of look at your application, but at least you preserve that option. So if it does become an important asset to you, you can leverage that and build it into your portfolio of IP. So yeah, so I tell clients have a plan. And start, just the comments here. It's hard to talk and read at the same time. And trade secret may be the option for you if you're developing something such as KFC, the secret recipe for their Kentucky Fried Chicken, or the Coca-Cola recipe. And you don't want to disclose that to anybody, and you could keep it locked down as a trade secret. And definitely that's valuable form of protection. And you don't need to go the patent route for that. But if you're making something that's easy to reverse engineer, as soon as you put it out there, people can take your product, figure out how it works, and make an exact copy of it. And it's pretty core to your business, and it's really innovative technology. No one else has done it before, and patenting may be difficult.
Saif, I know that you're itching to jump in here, because I see that they're talking about VCs and how VCs hate patents. So feel free, dive right in here.
Someone doesn't like VCs here. I feel like. Well, I think to a certain extent, it's relevant. We're talking about the patent and the VCs demand that, and it's important and all that. But working for BDC, and you mentioned earlier before as well, BDC being a Crown Corp is a slightly different sort of a VC. We're more investor, entrepreneur friendly. And most recently, Amy, you'd probably be aware of this, that BDC also launched an IP investment, IP financing arm. So if you are looking, to file an IP or a patent, so there is a financing arm that BDC has, and it's a recently launched investment arm, and you should be reaching out. But other than that, I don't think so. There's any as such, thing for VCs. We believe in patent or any of that.
Lina, you've worked with a lot of VCs over the course of your career. And so I feel like while you're not a VC and while you're not the patent lawyer here, you might have some perspective on patents and IP from your lens. So, I'd love to hear your vantage point.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'm honored. And Saif and Amy, please jump in and correct me where I might be wrong. But my personal experience, if I can draw on that primarily, it's an interesting thing when you look at a VC's investment philosophy and sort of their thesis on investment and where their focus is. I feel that really is a major driving factor when they're looking at companies to invest in. And then when they're evaluating those companies, I really don't ever see for the companies that I've helped raise money and working both on the side of the VC and advising them to actually working with the startups that are looking to raise. And I'm talking specifically about VCs and not private equity or angel investors or other LPs. But I would say, the question around patents and IP, really doesn't come up often. And as maybe a deciding factor, it's really not part of the equation. And so I can see Saif, agreeing with me, which is
yeah, 100%.
But it's interesting because I would say it often comes up after an investment is made, and perhaps while you're managing, the relationship with this startup to ensure that if they do hit a really great trajectory of growth, that you start thinking about those things, right? Okay, well, maybe we've got to take some safeguards. And I think that's more so the case also as you're entering new markets and you're expanding globally, only for the reason that at times you don't want to have that risk become greater than it might be. And so that's when people start thinking or talking about it. But the reality is, and I don't know, Amy, if you've seen this, I don't see too many companies coming after other companies for these types of things. If they're encroaching on their market or gaining adoption and growth that's going to rival the competitors in the space. I mean, I don't know. I don't see too many disputes over it, but yeah, that is a potential angle that can be taken. And yes, that would be a risk for the startup. But from my personal experience, I haven't seen it be part of the process or deciding factor when a VC is wanting to invest.
And just to add to that, I think over the last, whatever my career has been, 4 years in VC, to date, patent has never been a deal breaker or even a part of the lead discussion. Never. You mentioned that it comes later in the life cycle of the company. It is usually true in case of hardware-focused startups or something like that.
Yeah.
And those kind of VCs are sort of very different, and they have sort of their IP financing division as well. They know people within that space. They will guide you through that. So that sort of VC is different. I think eventually, if you talk about very general VC, majority of the VCs are investing in entrepreneurs. They are really after the entrepreneur. If it's a second-time entrepreneur, we're going to put in more money, higher valuation. So it's all about the entrepreneur. My friend, and I mentioned this earlier, just launched a company in the midst of the crisis. He was able to raise 2.5 million US just on a pitch deck, right? And it's because he's a second-time entrepreneur, and he's successful. He's a McGill dropout. He has, it's just a traditional, a successful entrepreneur. So it's all after that we look for.
I think what's really interesting is that the four of you bring such different perspectives to the table. And this is really what MT Ventures offers, right? So I feel very privileged to have you guys all around the table as my team of advisors, because when a company comes into us, we can actually help them navigate this space by talking to all four of you before they decide on whether they need a patent or a trademark or an industrial design. And so I feel very fortunate to have, great voices like you advising our companies. But from what I've seen, and I think Saif is right, is that hardware is very different from software. And so a lot of times it's really a distinction about what area you're working in and how much you need to protect your particular technology. A lot of software is open source nowadays. And so people feel like that's not as valuable to protect and very expensive to protect to go through someone like Amy. Whereas I think correct me if I'm wrong, but everything that we've looked at over the course of the last 6 months while we've launched Ventures is really hardware and a lot more hardware than software. So a real interesting dichotomy between those two areas.
Yeah, I would agree that there is a difference in how you treat hardware from software. Hardware is typically easier to reverse engineer, that's for sure. So easier to get copies made. So oftentimes hardware is suitable for patent protection. Software, it's a mixed bag. I do a lot of software patents. It's primarily sort of the area I practice in. And I often say to clients, you know what, it's just not worth going through the process for getting a patent on this. It will be obsolete, it just doesn't make sense. But if it is sort of really core technology and it's going to be around for the next few years, and I'd say, okay, well, this hasn't been done before. Why not try? Because this could end up being very useful for you down the road. And if not, well, you can always abandon your application. It's not like it's not like you're married to it and have to see it through all the way to the end. But at least you preserve that option. It's really not that expensive in a day to preserve that option and take that first step. And then you decide down the road whether you want to pursue global protection, which is really expensive and ends up costing a lot of money. You raise a lot of funds for that. Or just go into select markets. Just go into your key markets, just Canada and the US, and just at least have an enforceable patent there so you can keep your competitors locked out of the Canadian and US markets. One thing about patents too that is potentially useful too is if you get sued by someone for patent infringement, or at least get a cease and desist letter, a patent can be useful as sort of, I don't know, a defensive tool in some senses, because if you're practicing a competitor's technology, there is a good chance, if you have a patent on similar technology, they're practicing yours. So it's basically you're infringing on each other's patents. We could be in that situation where, if they're infringing, if you're infringing them, they're infringing you back. You can actually use that to leverage some kind of cross-licensing deals to get out of the expensive lawsuit that way. So that is another strategy that a lot of companies employ, just to be on the defensive side. They don't really want to commercialize their patents. They just want to use it as a tool, as a defense tool in case they get sued by other companies for patent infringement.
This has been a really active discussion, and there's a lot of chatter about patents and VCs. And before I ask my last question and ask you about your final thoughts, Saif, I just wanted to go back to something you said about IP financing, because there seems to be a lot of interest in this. And I know BDC has started a new arm. So if you could, I know you did on this, but if you could expand on that a little bit, I think that would be really helpful.
So BDC launched an IP financing arm. It's a $250 million fund. Comes directly into BDC capital. And the team, they haven't done any deal yet. I think it's an aqua hire. So basically, they've hired the whole team of an IP financing fund that was already private. We haven't done any deal yet, and if any one needs introduction to the IP financing team, I'm happy to do so. I'm not very well aware of the details and of the fund itself, but we internally have a meeting coming up in the next week or so regarding the whole fund, the dynamics. It's very new. It was just announced like a few weeks ago, not even yet. So happy to make introduction to the team if anyone wants that.
Thank you. Thanks so much for shedding some light on that. So before we let you guys all go, I recognize that we're probably standing in the way of some of your dinners. I just wanted to hear our last thoughts from our panelists. Any words of advice, wisdom that you would give to new startups or growing startups in the middle of the pandemic, and how to go about the next 6 to 12 months. I'm going to start with Leah.
Yeah, I think from an HR and employee perspective, what's really important is just to communicate to your team. I think that's been like a common theme as far as for any employee who is, with the company where there feels like there is uncertainty, where there's a shifting landscape and they're uncertain, what the future really holds, is providing that opportunity and those open channels of communication, and letting them really talk to, whoever they need within the department or across departments as well. And enabling them to know that, there are open channels, that the team is really there and available, and to have there are definitely some challenging conversations, and being frank and honest as far as it is for some companies. There have been different layoffs and different opportunities as far as what the realities of the context that they're operating within. But for any employee, what's really always helpful is being able to be honest and know that the team that they are a part of, kind of regardless of how things have landed currently, they're there to support them in whatever capacity that they can. And that and how you treat people, especially now, the kind of empathy that you have for whatever challenges that they're facing either personally or at work, will leave a mark, an impression within this employee's life, like not only their current life cycle as far as being a current employee, but also in the future. Because it is really these moments that employees remember in a way that they don't, other birthdays or other milestones that a company may have, but it is these moments that are so unique within their entire kind of employment career.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You talked about communication a number of times today. Are there any tools? I know people use Slack at work and other technology tools. Are there any tools that you would suggest for our company to use through this time to increase the amount of communication?
Yeah, well, if they have the option, particularly if they are a more agile and smaller startup, I would open the invitation for the employees and let them communicate as far as what their preference is. Some people do prefer Slack. although some people feel Slack fatigue because there are so many channels that can be open. So I definitely know that's a different kind of conversation. And so what it can mean, though, is that enabling your employees, particularly if you are a startup, you have that flexibility and a strength to be able to individualize that communication and what is most resonant and most useful and helpful for the employees. So I would really encourage, taking that time to reach out and to connect. And especially if your team is smaller, it will be that much more impactful because they'll feel heard. And I think, as humans and, part of our nature is just to be listened to and heard and understood.
Thank you. That's really great advice. And, there's a conversation going on in the chat right now about empathy and how important empathy is and leading with empathy. So I think you've hit the nail on the head. The first kind of key takeaway is communication and empathy. Amy, what about from your perspective? Any last words of wisdom for people who are in the startup space?
I forgot. Trademarks. I got a little sidetracked by Pat, so I just wanted to say a little nugget about trademarks, because often I advise startups on choosing a good name for their brand. Often client will say, "Oh, well, I did a domain name register search, and this is available, so I'm going to use that as my company name, my product name, or whatever." Is that the only thing you searched? And they're like, "Yep." And so then when I go and do my own searching, I find other companies in that space who don't have domain name registered under that name, but are using it as their trademark. So just wanted to end by saying, it's very important, especially now, to get your searching done in the early stages. Right now, the trademarks office, especially in Canada here, are heavily backlogged. So if you file a trademark application right now in Canada, you won't get a result from them probably until 2 or 3 years down the road. So you won't know 2 or 3 years from now if your trademark is approved for registration. That's a long time to wait. And in that time, you're building your brand, you're growing your business, building a reputation under this name you've picked, and you may end up having to change it all because you don't get approved for registration, or if someone else comes along and says, "Hey, I've been using that mark first, and you didn't know about it because you didn't do the proper searches." So I always encourage people to do the proper searches. Don't just look in the domain name registry. Talk to your trademark lawyer if you can, but do more extensive trademark databases in the various markets you plan to operate in, and find out if there's any other businesses that are using a similar name on similar products and services, because those are potential issues that may not materialize until 2 or 3 years down the road when you're actually successful. And then you're gonna have to spend a lot of money to deal with it because no one wants to give up their names. They've invested a lot in it, a lot of money to rebrand and start from square one. No one wants to give it up. So it's gonna be a really expensive legal battle. It keeps me employed, but you'd rather not have to do that. So I suggest just do your searches. Come talk to me. Don't just rely on your marketing specialist, because your marketing specialist say, "Ooh, yeah, that's a really nice, sexy name," and then they'll come talk to me, and I'll say, "No, don't do that. You're going to get yourself in trouble 2 or 3 years down the road. It's not going to work." So just get different perspectives on your choice of name before you launch your company, because you're a lot easier to pivot and change to a different name when you're still early stage, as opposed to 3 years down the road when the problems arise.
Thanks, Amy. That's really good advice. Make sure you searched your name, and make sure you have the rights to use it, so that 3 years down the road you don't have to stop using it and pivot to a different name. Lina, any last words of wisdom?
I would say stay the course, don't give up, and leverage all of the people that you have within your network, advisors, investors, family and friends that have expertise. Leverage everyone and anyone that you can get access to at this time. I would say be resourceful. Resourceful is super, super important right now, especially when we're talking about early stage startups. And then back to the whole premise of really staying focused on your minimum viable product and getting to market as quickly as possible. And it's an interesting chain that Leah started with, just talking about empathy. I think one thing that is important to call out is that it's just, as we talked about, building your product and service around your customers and figuring out who your customers are, because that could be evolving. It's also applying empathy in your product and service design. Empathy means actually putting yourself in the shoes of that customer so that you're building products and services that are going to hit the mark. And so I think there is a tie-in for sure to that. And I couldn't agree more with Leah. It's really important to be empathetic as leaders in this day and age, and to actually exercise leadership and not management right now, because people need to be inspired.
Thank you, Lina. I think inspiration is really what we're all looking for, and something to hope for, given that we've all been working from home for the last almost 7 months. Saif, your last thoughts?
Yeah, so I think I read this on Economist. I think it's about the economy. It's that the economy right now is sort of a deep hole. We know it's deep. We don't know how deep it is, and there's money going in. We don't know how much money we can put in, and so you have to think it from a similar perspective. As an early stage startup or even a later stage startup, have a plan B, plan B minus, plan B minus minus. I've seen companies that have plan B, B minus minus, B minus 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 as well. And then each trigger point, sort of like, okay, 6 month lockdown, second wave in November, second wave in December, have trigger points sort of planned. And then if there's a second wave in December, what are we going to do? Are we going to pivot? Are we going to pivot this much? Or, have that sort of, we don't know. There's so much uncertainty. Yeah. So plan as much as you can with different trigger points and be prepared for that. So that's my overall advice. And above all, I think we've said before, is like stay safe, take care of yourself, take care of your health. I think that's very important. And I must say, I'm really impressed with Lina's ability of multitasking. I recently thought that multitasking was a myth, because I read a lot about multitasking. But it looks like Lina was very responsive on the chat. Like, I'm just reading through, and she was like solid. And I couldn't see even her facial expression. She didn't feel like her face, like as if she was listening to us.
You must have a bot doing it all for her.
Broken, but that's also safe. Thanks for calling that out. That's so good. I thought I was being really discreet. I was like, tap, tap, tap.
Good job on that.
Thank you guys. You've been awesome. So if I was to summarize, your 5 major points from this afternoon, evening, depending on what time zone you're in. The first is communicate and lead with empathy. As you're building your startup, communicate, over communicate, keep talking, tell your employees what's going on, tell your customers what's going on, over communicate and lead with empathy. I think the second thing is build your brand. And when you're building your brand, and Leah talks about building your brand and making sure that your brand is what you stand for and what your vision and mission is. You need to protect your brand. And Amy talks about making sure that if it's a trademark or a patent or whatever it is that is the center of your brand, protect it. The third thing I think is given the times that we're in right now, stay the course. If you're able to, stay the course, because if you build it and if you build it right, the customer will come and you will win at the end. And then I think fourth is, leverage your network. We've got big networks all across the country. People want to help. People are really generous with their time right now. So leverage your network, use all of your resources. And I think the last thing, Saif, you talked about this a little bit, is have a plan and make sure you've got a plan B, C, D, E, whatever you need, and whatever trigger point that triggers B, C, or D, make sure you're ready to move on to it. And so, with that, I'm going to wrap up the session. Thank you so much for all being here. Thank you to our panelists for, making your words of wisdom heard and giving back to this community, because our startup community is really our Canada's future.
Absolutely.